The Mississippi sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless August sky, beating down on the endless sea of cotton that stretched to the horizon. Solomon Reed's hands moved mechanically among the white bowls, each movement precise despite the exhaustion that seeped into his very bones. At 32, he had spent 27 years in these fields, his life measured in cotton baskets and the cruel arithmetic of the plantation. Elmwood Plantation was considered one of the most productive estates in Yazoo County, its 4,000 acres yielding cotton that kept the mills of Manchester spinning year-round. Its owner, Judge Thaddeus Wilkins, was rarely present, preferring the comforts of his Natchez mansion to the mosquito-infested Delta. In his absence, Elmwood was ruled by Silas Haynes, an overseer whose reputation for brutality had spread throughout the county. Solomon's back bore the evidence of Haynes's handiwork, a latticework of scars, some decades old, others fresh enough that they still wept in the humid air. Yet it wasn't his own suffering that occupied Solomon's thoughts as he methodically stripped the cotton plants. It was the memory of his wife's screams that echoed in his mind, growing neither fainter nor less agonizing with the passage of time. 3 months had passed since Rachel had been taken to the whipping post for allegedly sabotaging her loom in the plantation's textile shed. 3 months since Haynes had administered 20 lashes while forcing Solomon to watch, helpless and restrained. 3 months since infection had set into her wounds, burning through her body until she slipped away despite Solomon's desperate attempts to save her with poultices and prayers. "Reed, pick up the pace or taste the whip," the voice cut through Solomon's dark reverie. Jeremiah Haynes, the overseer's 19-year-old son and apprentice in cruelty, sat atop his horse at the edge of the field, a riding crop slapping rhythmically against his thigh. The young man had inherited his father's sadistic disposition, but lacked his calculating restraint. Where Silas understood that slaves were valuable property not to be damaged without cause, Jeremiah seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from inflicting pain for its own sake. Solomon raised his eyes just enough to acknowledge the command before increasing his pace. He had learned long ago to mask his thoughts, to present a facade of resigned compliance that revealed nothing of the storm that raged within. It was a skill that had kept him alive, while others who showed defiance were broken or killed. "That's better," Jeremiah sneered, clearly disappointed at being denied an excuse for violence. "Father wants to see you at the equipment shed when the bell rings. Don't make him wait." With that, he wheeled his horse around and trotted toward another section of the vast field. Solomon felt a tightening in his chest. A summons from Silas Haynes never boded well. The overseer rarely spoke directly to the field hands, except to issue punishments or make examples. As he continued harvesting cotton, Solomon mentally reviewed his recent actions, searching for any transgression that might have drawn the overseer's attention. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the day's labor, Solomon emptied his sack at the weighing station, where a clerk meticulously recorded each slave's output. Solomon's tally was among the highest, as always, a fact that had kept him in the fields, rather than sold off when production quotas increased. "Good weight, Reed," the clerk noted dispassionately. "Haynes is waiting for you at the shed." Solomon nodded and set off toward the equipment shed, a sturdy structure where the plantation's tools and hardware were stored and maintained. His muscles ached with the day's labor, but he kept his pace steady, knowing that tardiness would only worsen whatever awaited him. The equipment shed stood apart from the other buildings, surrounded by a small clearing. As Solomon approached, he saw Silas Haynes standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the interior gloom. At 53, Haynes retained the powerful build of his younger days, though a slight paunch now hung over his belt. His face, weathered by years in the sun, was dominated by cold blue eyes that seemed to strip away any pretense of humanity from those they regarded. "Reed," Haynes acknowledged, as Solomon stopped a respectful distance away. "Come inside. Got a job needs doing." Solomon followed the overseer into the shed, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. The interior was meticulously organized, tools hung on walls, barrels of nails and other hardware stacked in corners, plows and heavier equipment arranged in neat rows. A workbench ran along one wall, cluttered with projects in various stages of completion. "Judge Wilkins is coming for inspection next week," Haynes said, moving to the workbench. "Wants everything in top condition. You've got a knack for metalwork, as I recall." It wasn't a question, but Solomon responded anyway. "Yes, sir. My father taught me some, and Master Preston's blacksmith showed me more before I came here." Solomon had been born on a smaller plantation in Virginia, where his father had served as both field hand and occasional assistant to the blacksmith. The rudimentary skills he had learned there had been honed during his first years at Elmwood, before Rachel had arrived and before the cotton expansion had made field labor the priority for every able-bodied slave. Good. These need fixing. Haynes gestured to a pile of tools on the bench: hoes with loose heads, shovels with splintered handles, a rusted plow blade that needed cleaning and sharpening. You'll work here evenings until it's done. I'm adding an hour to your day. The work better be right or you'll answer for it. Solomon kept his expression neutral despite the surge of resentment. An extra hour of labor when he was already working from dawn to dusk meant less time to tend his small garden plot, less time to mend the roof of his cabin before the autumn rains came, less time to simply exist outside the demands of the plantation. Yes, sir, I understand. Haynes studied him for a moment, perhaps searching for signs of insolence or defiance. Finding none in Solomon's carefully composed features, he gave a curt nod. Start now. I'll be back to check your progress before dark. As the overseer left, Solomon turned to the workbench, methodically assessing the tools that needed repair. The work itself didn't trouble him. In fact, there had been a time when he had enjoyed the precision and creativity of metalwork, the transformation of raw materials into useful objects. But that had been before Elmwood, before Haynes, before Rachel's death had hollowed out any capacity for joy. Solomon began organizing the repairs, starting with the simplest, reattaching hoe heads to their handles, replacing broken shovel shafts. As his hands worked, his mind continued its constant circulation of memories and grief. He and Rachel had been together for 11 years, brought to Elmwood in the same purchase when Judge Wilkins had expanded his holdings. They had not been legally married. Such formalities were rarely extended to enslaved people, but they had jumped the broom in a ceremony witnessed by their community, binding themselves to each other as completely as their circumstances allowed. Rachel had been a weaver, skilled at producing the rough cloth used for slave garments and occasionally finer textiles for the main house. She had taught Solomon to read in secret, patiently guiding him through a tattered Bible page by page during the precious few hours they had together. That dangerous knowledge had opened a world beyond the plantation, feeding a hunger for freedom that grew with each passing year. They had planned to escape 3 times, each attempt thwarted by circumstances. Increased patrols due to rumors of abolitionist activity, Rachel's illness one winter, Solomon's temporary transfer to another plantation during a harvest crisis. And then, after the last failed attempt, Rachel had been caught with a map Solomon had laboriously copied from a book glimpsed in Judge Wilkins's library during a rare assignment at the main house. The punishment had been 20 lashes, severe but survivable. But Haynes had used a whip soaked in brine, and the infection that followed had proven beyond Solomon's limited medical knowledge. Rachel had died in his arms, her final words a whispered plea, "Don't let this place be the end of you." As Solomon worked in the equipment shed, the light gradually fading as evening approached, he found himself handling a particular tool with growing attention, a hand scythe used for clearing brush, its curved blade recently sharpened to a wicked edge. The wooden handle fit comfortably in his palm, the weight perfectly balanced for a sweeping strike. An image flashed unbidden in his mind, the blade arcing through the air, finding Haynes's throat in a single decisive movement. The thought should have horrified him, but instead Solomon felt a cold clarity descending, as if some internal debate had finally been resolved. For years he had endured, keeping his head down, playing the role of the compliant slave while nurturing the dream of escape. But that dream had died with Rachel, replaced by something darker and more immediate. He would never be free of Elmwood while Haynes lived. That much had become increasingly clear. The overseer seemed to take particular pleasure in thwarting Solomon's small attempts to make his existence bearable, as if he sensed and resented the inner dignity that Solomon struggled to maintain. Making progress? The voice startled Solomon from his thoughts. Silas Haynes stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light of sunset. Solomon carefully placed the scythe back on the workbench, ensuring his movements betrayed nothing of his violent contemplation. "Yes, sir." "Fix the hoes and most of the shovels, working on the plow blade next." Haynes stepped into the shed, inspecting the repaired tools with critical eyes. He tested the attachment of several hoe heads, grunting with reluctant approval. "Acceptable. You'll continue tomorrow evening." "Yes, sir." As Haynes turned to leave, he paused, his gaze falling on the scythe. "That reminds me. Judge Wilkins wants the path to the river landing cleared before his arrival. You'll add that to your duties. Take that scythe. The others are all assigned." "Yes, sir." Solomon's voice remained steady despite the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. "I'll see to it." Haynes lingered a moment longer, his cold eyes studying Solomon with what might have been suspicion or merely habitual contempt. Then with a final curt nod he left, his footsteps receding into the gathering darkness. Solomon remained at the workbench, his hands perfectly still as he processed what had just occurred. He had been given custody of the very weapon his mind had selected, along with a legitimate reason to have it in his possession, away from the equipment shed. If he believed in signs, this would certainly qualify. But Solomon had stopped believing in divine intervention the night Rachel died. This wasn't providence, it was opportunity, created by the overseer's own arrogance and indifference. Haynes saw him as a tool, as interchangeable and disposable as the implements he was repairing. That blindness would be his undoing. As Solomon finished his assigned tasks and prepared to return to the slave quarters, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The constant turmoil of grief and rage that had churned within him since Rachel's death seemed to quiet, replaced by a singular focus that clarified his every thought. He would kill Silas Haynes, not in a fit of passion or desperate rebellion, but with the same methodical precision he applied to his metalwork. He would plan carefully, execute cleanly, and then he would run north toward the Free States, carrying Rachel's memory and the overseer's blood as his traveling companions. The decision, once made, seemed to change something fundamental in Solomon's perception. As he walked back to the cramped, dilapidated cabin he had once shared with Rachel, the familiar surroundings of Elmwood Plantation appeared somehow less substantial, as if they were already receding into memory rather than containing his present reality. In the distance, he could see the lights of the main house where Judge Wilkins would soon arrive, and beyond that, the dark silhouette of the overseer's residence where Haynes and his son now sat down to their evening meal, unaware that the hour of reckoning approached. Further still lay the vast unknown territories of the north and the tantalizing promise of freedom. Solomon entered his cabin and carefully tucked the scythe beneath his sleeping pallet. Tomorrow he would begin clearing the path to the river landing, establishing a routine that would arouse no suspicion. He would observe Haynes's movements, identify patterns and vulnerabilities, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, he would ensure that the overseer's last breath carried the knowledge that his death was not random violence, but righteous retribution, the settling of a debt written in Rachel's blood and sealed with her final plea. As darkness claimed the plantation and the sounds of the day faded into nighttime murmurs, Solomon Reed closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to plan. For the first time since Rachel's death, his purpose was absolutely clear. Vengeance first, then freedom, or death in the attempt. Either way, his days at Elmwood were numbered. What he couldn't know as he lay in the darkness of his cabin was how his individual act of rebellion would ripple outward, affecting not just his own fate, but the lives of dozens of others caught in the brutal machinery of the Cotton Kingdom. The seeds of vengeance once planted would yield a harvest that none could fully predict. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. The path to the river landing wound through a stretch of untamed growth that separated Elmwood's manicured cotton fields from the muddy banks of the Yazoo River. Once cleared regularly for the transport of cotton bales to waiting steamboats, it had fallen into disuse when Judge Wilkins purchased a more convenient landing downriver. Now, with the judge's impending visit, the forgotten trail needed restoration, a task that had fallen to Solomon. For 5 consecutive evenings, after completing his regular field work and the extra hour in the equipment shed, Solomon had labored on the path, the scythe swinging in rhythmic arcs as he cleared away the encroaching vegetation. The work was exhausting, coming as it did after already grueling days, but Solomon welcomed the solitude. Away from the watchful eyes of Haynes and the other slaves, he could think freely, refining his plans for escape, while his body performed the mechanical task of clearing. On this particular evening, the 6th since receiving his additional duties, Solomon paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, leaning on the scythe as he surveyed his progress. The path was now cleared almost to the river, revealing the rotting wooden dock that jutted into the sluggish water. Another day's work would complete the task, well before Judge Wilkins's arrival. As he prepared to resume his labors, a sound from further down the path caught his attention, the distinctive rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Solomon straightened, his grip on the scythe shifting subtly from a laborer's hold to something more purposeful. Then, recognizing the opportunity was not yet right, he deliberately relaxed his stance, adopting the carefully neutral expression that was his habitual mask. Jeremiah Haynes emerged from a bend in the path, his horse picking its way carefully through the freshly cleared ground. The overseer's son wore his customary smirk, the riding crop tapping against his thigh in that restless manner that always signaled trouble. "Reed," he acknowledged, reining his horse to a stop. "Father sent me to check your progress." His eyes swept dismissively over the cleared path. "Seems you're taking your sweet time about it." "Nearly finished, sir," Solomon replied, his voice devoid of inflection. "Another day should see it done." Jeremiah's mouth twisted in disappointment at the reasonable response. He had clearly been hoping for an excuse to exercise his authority. "Well, see that it is. Father says Judge Wilkins may want to inspect the landing personally." "Yes, sir." The young man's gaze shifted to the scythe in Solomon's hands, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's a sharp blade you've got there. Keeping it in good condition?" "Yes, sir. I sharpen it each evening before returning it to the shed." Jeremiah dismounted, his movements deliberate as he stepped closer. At 19, he was already nearly as tall as his father, though lacking the older man's muscular build. What he lacked in physical presence, however, he made up for in calculating cruelty. "Let me see it," he demanded, holding out his hand. Solomon hesitated only a fraction of a second before carefully presenting the scythe, handle first. Jeremiah took it, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. "Sharp indeed," he murmured, a strange light entering his eyes. "You know, Reed, Father says you're one of the few who actually has a brain in your head, says it makes you dangerous." He swung the scythe experimentally, the blade whistling through the humid air. "I don't see it myself. Just looks like another nigger to me." Solomon remained silent, knowing from bitter experience that any response would only feed Jeremiah's desire to provoke. The young overseer continued swinging the scythe, moving closer to Solomon with each arc. "Did you sharpen this with my father in mind, Reed?" Jeremiah asked suddenly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've seen how you look at him when you think no one's watching, like you're measuring him for a coffin." The accusation, so unnervingly close to the truth, sent a chill down Solomon's spine. Had he been that transparent? Or was Jeremiah simply fishing, hoping to goad him into a reaction that would justify punishment? "No, sir," Solomon replied carefully. "Just doing the work I was assigned." Jeremiah laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You're a good liar, Reed. Better than most. But I know what you're thinking." He lowered the scythe, stepping close enough that Solomon could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You're thinking about your woman, aren't you? The one who couldn't take her medicine." Solomon felt something shift inside him, a fracturing of the careful control he had maintained for months. Rachel's death had never been acknowledged as anything but the expected consequence of justified punishment. To hear it dismissed so callously, reduced to a failure of strength rather than recognized as the murder it was, ignited a rage that threatened to consume his carefully laid plans. "She had a name," Solomon said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Her name was Rachel." Jeremiah's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected response, then narrowed in dangerous amusement. "It speaks back," he said with mock surprise. "And here I thought you were one of the well-trained ones." He raised the scythe again, positioning the blade near Solomon's face. "What else do you want to say, Reed? While you still have a tongue to say it with." The threat hung in the air between them, a moment balanced on the edge of the blade. Solomon could see multiple futures branching from this instant: submission and survival, defiance and probable death, or something in between, a calculated risk that might preserve both his life and his dignity. "Nothing, sir," Solomon finally replied, lowering his eyes in a display of deference that cost him dearly. "I spoke out of turn." Jeremiah studied him for a long moment, visibly disappointed by the capitulation. Then, with a contemptuous snort, he thrust the scythe back into Solomon's hands. "Get back to work and remember your place, Reed. It's in the dirt, just like your woman." As Jeremiah remounted his horse and rode away, Solomon stood motionless, the scythe clutched in white-knuckled hands, the blade reflecting the dying light of the setting sun. The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not just because of the danger it represented, but because of what it revealed about his own readiness. He had come dangerously close to striking in unplanned anger rather than calculated retribution. Such impulsive action would almost certainly have led to his immediate death, leaving his promise to Rachel unfulfilled. He needed to be more careful, to guard not just his actions, but his very expressions from suspicious eyes. Yet even as he acknowledged the need for caution, Solomon recognized that time was running short. Judge Wilkins would arrive within days, bringing with him increased scrutiny and activity that would make both murder and escape more difficult. Moreover, Jeremiah's suspicious comments suggested that the overseers were already watching him with particular attention. The window of opportunity was narrowing. He would need to act soon, tomorrow, or the next day at the latest. With this resolution firming in his mind, Solomon resumed his work on the path, the scythe slicing through vegetation with renewed purpose. Each swing was now practice, each cut a rehearsal for the moment when the blade would meet flesh instead of foliage. As darkness began to fall, Solomon reluctantly returned to the slave quarters, storing the scythe in the equipment shed as required. The small community of enslaved people was already settling in for the night, exhausted from the day's labor. Solomon nodded to a few familiar faces but avoided conversation, his mind too preoccupied with his plans to engage in the small social interactions that helped make life at Elmwood bearable for many. His solitary behavior had not gone unnoticed. As he approached his cabin, an elderly woman named Bessie, who had been at Elmwood longer than anyone could remember, stepped into his path. "You got that look again," she said without preamble, her rheumy eyes sharp despite her advanced years. "That dangerous look." Solomon attempted to brush past her. "Don't know what you mean, Auntie." Bessie's gnarled hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping his arm. "Yes, you do. Been seeing it since they put Rachel in the ground. Getting stronger every day." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Whatever you're planning, boy, think on who'll pay the price besides yourself." The warning gave Solomon pause. Bessie had a point he hadn't fully considered. Retribution for slave violence often extended beyond the perpetrator to the wider community. If he killed Haynes and was caught, Judge Wilkins might well order collective punishment, more whippings, reduced rations, increased workloads for everyone at Elmwood. "I'm not planning anything," he lied, gently disengaging from her grip. "Just tired is all." Bessie's expression made it clear she didn't believe him, but she didn't press further. "Just remember," she said as he moved past her toward his cabin, "every action casts a shadow longer than itself." Solomon entered his cabin, the old woman's words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. He had been so focused on his personal vendetta that he hadn't fully considered its potential consequences for others. The realization didn't change his resolve. Haynes would still die by his hand, but it added urgency to the escape that must follow. He needed to be far away before the murder was discovered, giving the community at Elmwood plausible deniability. That night, sleep eluded Solomon as he refined his plan. The path to the river landing was now nearly complete, providing a direct route to potential escape after the deed was done. Judge Wilkins was scheduled to arrive in 3 days, which meant Haynes would be increasingly occupied with preparations, potentially creating moments when the overseer was alone and vulnerable. The murder itself would need to be swift and silent. The scythe would serve its purpose, but only if Solomon could approach Haynes undetected. Timing would be crucial, too early in the day, and the body might be discovered before Solomon could put sufficient distance between himself and Elmwood. Too late, and darkness would hamper his flight. As plans and contingencies tumbled through his mind, Solomon was startled by a soft knock at his cabin door. Instantly alert, he rose from his pallet, moving silently to peer through a crack in the rough wooden planks. Isaiah Johnson stood outside, glancing nervously over his shoulder. A fellow field hand in his mid-20s, Isaiah had been brought to Elmwood only 2 years earlier and had formed a tentative friendship with Solomon based largely on proximity in the fields rather than any deep connection. Solomon hesitated before opening the door. He had been deliberately isolating himself in recent weeks, minimizing any relationships that might complicate his plans or put others at risk. What could Isaiah want at this hour? Curiosity winning out over caution, Solomon unlatched the door, opening it just enough to see the younger man's anxious face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Need to talk to you," Isaiah whispered. "Important. Can I come in?" After a moment's consideration, Solomon stepped back, allowing Isaiah to slip into the cabin before quickly closing the door behind him. "This better be worth risking a whipping," Solomon said. "You know we're not supposed to be visiting after curfew." Isaiah nodded, his expression grave in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single small window. "Wouldn't come if it wasn't important. It's about Haynes." Solomon felt his body tense, immediately suspicious. Had his intentions somehow become common knowledge among the slaves? Was this a warning or something else? "What about him?" he asked carefully. "He's been asking questions. About you specifically. Wanted to know if you've been talking about running, if you've said anything against him or the plantation." Isaiah shifted uncomfortably. "He asked me directly because we work the same row sometimes. Said he'd make it worth my while if I kept an eye on you and reported anything unusual." The information hit Solomon like a physical blow. His suspicions had been correct. Haynes was watching him, perhaps even setting a trap. The noose was tightening before he'd even made his move. "What did you tell him?" Solomon asked, studying Isaiah's face for any sign of deception. "Told him you keep to yourself mostly. Don't talk much since Rachel passed." Isaiah met his gaze directly. "Didn't tell him you've been looking at the North Star every night, or that you've been saving extra food, or that sometimes you practice running in the woods when you think no one's watching." Solomon's breath caught. Isaiah had been observing him far more closely than he'd realized. "And why are you telling me this now?" Isaiah's voice dropped even lower. "Because I want to go with you when you run." The declaration hung in the air between them, unexpected and fraught with complication. Solomon had planned his escape as a solitary venture, simpler, safer, with only his own life at stake if things went wrong. Adding another person, especially one he didn't fully trust, introduced variables he wasn't prepared to manage. "What makes you think I'm running?" he deflected. Isaiah gave him a look that bordered on pity. "Everyone with eyes can see it, Solomon. You've been dead inside since Rachel, and then suddenly you're alive again, but different. Planning something. Most folks think you're going to try to kill Haynes." He paused. "Are you?" The direct question demanded a direct answer, but Solomon wasn't ready to incriminate himself, even to a fellow slave who claimed to want freedom. "If I was," he said carefully, "adding murder to escape would make the hunters that much more determined to catch me." "Us," Isaiah corrected. "To catch us. I'm serious about coming with you. I've got family in Pennsylvania. An uncle who bought his freedom 5 years back. He's in Philadelphia. Said in his letter he'd help any family who made it north." This new information changed the calculation. A contact in Philadelphia could be invaluable, potentially providing shelter and connections to the Underground Railroad, but it also raised questions about Isaiah's story. Letters from free relatives in the North were rarely delivered to slaves, being viewed by masters as dangerous incitements to escape. "How'd you get a letter from a free man in Philadelphia?" Solomon asked skeptically. "Didn't come direct," Isaiah explained. "My mother's still on the Johnson's place in Tennessee. Master Johnson's daughter taught her to read a bit. Uncle's letters go to her, and she finds ways to pass the word to me through traders and travelers." The explanation was plausible enough, though Solomon remained cautious. "Even if I was planning to run, which I'm not saying I am, adding another person doubles the risk. 2 are easier to spot than 1, or twice as hard to catch if we separate when needed," Isaiah countered. 2 can keep watch while the other sleeps. 2 can help each other if one gets hurt." He leaned forward intently. "I'm not asking for charity, Solomon. I'm offering a partnership. My family connection at the end. You're planning to get us there." Solomon studied the younger man, weighing the sincerity in his eyes against the risks of trust. Isaiah seemed genuine, and his observations about Solomon's behavior suggested he was both perceptive and discreet. Moreover, his warning about Haynes's suspicions was valuable intelligence that might have saved Solomon from walking into a trap. "If, and I mean if, I was considering such a thing," Solomon said slowly, "when would you be ready to go? Tonight? Tomorrow? Whenever?" Isaiah's immediate response held no hesitation. "I've been ready to leave this place since the day they brought me here." The conviction in his voice resonated with Solomon's own desperate desire for freedom. Still, caution prevailed. "Let me think on it," he said finally. "We'll talk again tomorrow." Isaiah nodded, accepting the non-committal response. "Fair enough, but don't wait too long. Haynes is watching you close. Whatever you're planning, he suspects something." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing you should know, Judge Wilkins isn't coming alone. He's bringing potential buyers to see the plantation. Word is he's considering selling Elmwood, lock, stock, and barrel." This final piece of information landed like a thunderbolt. A sale would mean potential separation of families, relocation to unknown conditions, perhaps even being sent to the dreaded cotton plantations further south in Louisiana, where few survived more than a few years. For many at Elmwood, such a fate would be worse than death. After Isaiah departed, Solomon sat in the darkness of his cabin, reassessing his plans in light of these new developments. The window of opportunity wasn't just narrowing, it was on the verge of slamming shut. Haynes's suspicions, combined with the impending arrival of Judge Wilkins and potential buyers, created a volatile situation that demanded immediate action. The question was no longer whether to kill Haynes and run, but whether to include Isaiah in the plan. The younger man's family connection in Philadelphia was tempting, offering a concrete destination rather than the abstract north that had been Solomon's goal. But trusting anyone with the knowledge of premeditated murder was dangerous for both of them. As dawn approached, bringing with it another day of labor in the cotton fields, Solomon came to a decision. He would kill Haynes tomorrow night after completing the path to the river landing. And he would allow Isaiah to accompany him in the escape that followed, not as a participant in the murder, but as a companion in flight. The die was cast. In 24 hours, Solomon Reed would transform from an enslaved field hand to a fugitive murderer, with the blood of Silas Haynes as his baptism into freedom, and the uncertain path north as his salvation. What he didn't yet realize was that his personal vendetta was about to collide with larger forces already in motion across Elmwood Plantation, forces that would transform his individual act of rebellion into something far more consequential than he had ever intended. Chapter 3. The final day dawn broke over Elmwood Plantation with a crimson intensity that seemed to stain the cotton fields red, as if nature itself were acknowledging the blood that would soon be spilled. Solomon stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the sunrise with the heightened awareness of a man who knows he is seeing familiar sights for the last time. Today would be his final day as a slave, one way or another. By nightfall, he would either be a fugitive racing northward toward an uncertain freedom, or a corpse swinging from one of the oak trees that lined Elmwood's main avenue. There would be no middle ground, no reprieve, no return to the grinding routine that had defined his existence for so long. The morning bell rang, summoning the field hands to another day of labor. Solomon joined the procession of weary bodies moving toward the fields, his eyes scanning the assembled slaves for Isaiah. He spotted the younger man near the back of the group, his expression carefully neutral when their gazes met. Solomon gave an imperceptible nod, confirmation of their unspoken pact. At the edge of the cotton field, Silas Haynes sat atop his horse, tallying the slaves as they took their positions among the rows. His cold eyes lingered on Solomon for a moment longer than necessary, a subtle confirmation of Isaiah's warning. The overseer was watching him with particular attention. "Reed," Haynes called out as Solomon passed. "You finished that path to the landing yet?" "Nearly done, sir," Solomon replied, keeping his eyes appropriately lowered. "Should complete it this evening." Haynes grunted. "See that you do. Judge Wilkins arrives tomorrow midday. Everything needs to be perfect." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "And Reed, I'll be checking your work personally tonight. Make sure it's up to standard." The statement contained both a warning and an opportunity. Haynes would be at the river landing, away from the main plantation buildings, isolated as darkness fell. It was an almost perfect scenario for what Solomon had planned, perhaps too perfect. Was it a trap? Had Haynes somehow discerned his murderous intentions and decided to force his hand in a location where any confrontation would favor the overseer? "Yes, sir," Solomon responded, betraying none of his internal calculations. "I'll make sure it's done right." As he took his place in the field and began the familiar routine of harvesting cotton, Solomon's mind worked through contingencies. If Haynes was setting a trap, he would likely not come alone. Jeremiah, or one of the other white overseers, might be concealed nearby, ready to intervene if Solomon made a move against Haynes. He would need to be cautious, to observe carefully before committing to action. Perhaps he could arrive at the landing early, scout the area, ensure there were no hidden observers waiting to catch him in the act. The original plan had been to kill Haynes at the landing and then immediately flee down the cleared path to the river, where he had already scouted several potential hiding places for a small boat or raft. Now he would need to adjust, perhaps creating a diversion to ensure Haynes truly came alone. The day passed with excruciating slowness, each hour marked by the relentless Mississippi sun climbing higher in the sky before beginning its gradual descent. Solomon worked mechanically, his body performing the familiar motions of harvesting cotton, while his mind remained fixed on the evening to come. He avoided conversation even with Isaiah, not trusting himself to maintain the facade of normality with freedom and vengeance so tantalizingly close. As the workday neared its end, Solomon became aware of increased activity around the main house. A wagon had arrived bearing supplies for Judge Wilkins's visit, extra foodstuffs, linens, and several crates that likely contained the fine wines the judge was known to favor. The house slaves moved with the nervous energy that always preceded the master's visits, their tasks supervised by the head house slave, an elderly man named Cyrus, who had been with the judge's family for over 50 years. The arrival of the wagon was a reminder of the wider world beyond Elmwood, a world Solomon had not seen since being brought to the plantation years ago. It also provided potentially useful information. The road would be watched more carefully with visitors expected, which meant escape in that direction would be risky. The river route was clearly the better option, confirming his original plan. When the end-of-day bell finally rang, Solomon emptied his cotton sack at the weighing station and headed directly to the equipment shed to retrieve the scythe. The clerk recorded his weight without comment, slightly below Solomon's usual production, but not enough to draw unwelcome attention on this particular day. At the shed, Solomon collected the scythe with a sense of grim purpose. The blade gleamed in the late afternoon light, recently sharpened to an edge that would slice through flesh with minimal resistance. He tested it with his thumb, nodding in satisfaction before setting off toward the river landing. The path he had spent the past week clearing looked different now that it was nearly complete, a straight line cutting through the tangled undergrowth, leading from the carefully cultivated order of Elmwood to the wild unpredictability of the river. It seemed an apt metaphor for the journey he was about to undertake, from the structured brutality of slavery to the dangerous freedom of fugitive life. Solomon worked steadily for the first hour, clearing the final stretch of vegetation that separated the path from the dilapidated dock. The physical labor helped calm his racing thoughts, establishing a rhythm that grounded him in the present moment rather than the approaching confrontation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, Solomon set the scythe aside and moved to inspect the dock itself. The wooden structure was in worse condition than it had appeared from a distance, with several planks rotted through and others hanging precariously over the muddy water. It would need significant repairs before it could safely support Judge Wilkins and his potential buyers. Solomon knelt at the edge of the dock, ostensibly examining the damage while actually scanning the surrounding area for any sign of ambush. The tangled vegetation provided ample hiding places, but his experienced eye detected no evidence of recent disturbance beyond his own trail. If Haynes had positioned someone to watch, they had been remarkably careful about concealing their approach. Satisfied that he was, for the moment, alone, Solomon returned to the end of the cleared path and resumed work on the few remaining patches of undergrowth. The scythe swung in practiced arcs, each cut bringing him closer to the decisive moment when the blade would taste blood instead of vegetation. The sun had just touched the tops of the distant trees when Solomon heard the approaching hoofbeats. He straightened, rolling his shoulders as if to relieve the tension of labor while actually preparing his body for what was to come. The scythe remained in his hands, its position natural for the task he was supposedly completing. Silas Haynes appeared around a bend in the path, his horse picking its way carefully through the freshly cleared ground. The overseer was alone, just as he had said he would be, his rifle secured in its saddle holster rather than in his hands. Either he suspected nothing, or his confidence in his dominance over Solomon was so complete that he felt no need for immediate precautions. "Reed," Haynes acknowledged as he drew his horse to a halt several yards from where Solomon stood. "Let's see what you've accomplished." Solomon stepped aside, gesturing toward the completed path and the dock beyond. "Finish the clearing, sir. The dock itself needs repair before it can be used. Several planks are rotted through." Haynes dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby sapling before striding past Solomon to inspect the path. His back was momentarily exposed, presenting a perfect target, but Solomon hesitated. The moment didn't feel right. Too exposed, too obvious. If he struck now and somehow failed to kill Haynes instantly, the overseer would have room to maneuver. perhaps even to reach his rifle. "Acceptable work on the path," Haynes said, turning back to face Solomon. "The dock will have to wait. Judge Wilkins can at least see the landing is accessible." His cold eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been quiet lately, Reed, keeping to yourself." The observation was casually delivered, but laden with suspicion. Solomon kept his expression neutral, though his grip on the scythe tightened imperceptibly. "Just focused on the work, sir." "Is that so?" Haynes took a step closer, his gaze moving from Solomon's face to the scythe in his hands and back again. "Strange. Jeremiah seems to think you've had something else on your mind. Says you've been looking at me differently since your woman died." The direct reference to Rachel sent a surge of rage through Solomon's body, hot and immediate. He struggled to contain it, knowing that to react now would be to spring the trap before he was ready. "Just doing what I'm told, sir," he managed, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Haynes studied him for a long moment, then gave a dismissive snort. "Well, whatever you're thinking, get it out of your head. Judge Wilkins is bringing serious buyers tomorrow. I need everyone on their best behavior." He turned toward the dock, presenting his back once again. "Now show me what needs fixing down here." Solomon followed a few paces behind, the scythe still in his hands, his senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement around them. The dock creaked ominously as Haynes stepped onto it, testing the boards with his boot. "Completely rotted through," the overseer muttered, kicking at a particularly degraded plank. "Should have had this repaired weeks ago." Solomon remained at the edge of the dock, watching as Haynes moved further out over the water. The setting sun cast the overseer's shadow long across the weathered wood, stretching it to grotesque proportions. For a moment, Solomon imagined it was the shadow of the man's true nature, monstrous, distorted, larger than the physical form that contained it. Haynes turned suddenly, catching Solomon's gaze. Something in the slave's expression must have betrayed his thoughts, for the overseer's hand moved to the knife at his belt. "What are you looking at, Reed?" The moment crystallized with perfect clarity. Haynes was suspicious but not yet certain, poised between caution and complacency. He was also isolated, standing on an unstable structure with limited room to maneuver. There would never be a better opportunity. "Thinking about Rachel, sir," Solomon replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he took a step forward. "About how she looked when she died." Haynes's expression hardened, his hand closing around the hilt of his knife. "You'd best watch your tone, boy. I did what was necessary. She broke the rules." "She was reading a Bible," Solomon said, taking another step onto the dock, the scythe now held at an angle that could still appear innocent, but would allow for a swift upward swing. "Teaching others about freedom. That was her crime." "Her crime was thinking she was better than her station," Haynes snapped, now fully alert to the danger, but still not drawing his weapon. Perhaps he was waiting for Solomon to make the first move, to provide justification for whatever punishment he intended to deliver. "Just like you're doing now." Solomon felt an eerie calm descend over him, as if he were observing the scene from somewhere outside his own body. "We were never meant to be slaves, Mr. Haynes. Never meant to be property. That's not a station, it's a theft of life." Haynes's face contorted with rage. "Enough! You forget yourself, Reed. 20 lashes might remind you of your place." He finally drew his knife, the blade catching the dying sunlight. "Or perhaps you need a more permanent reminder, like that girl of yours got." The mention of Rachel, coupled with the direct threat, shattered Solomon's supernatural calm. With a fluid motion born of a week's practice, he swung the scythe upward in a vicious arc. Haynes, anticipating the attack, attempted to step backward, but the rotted dock groaned beneath his weight. A plank gave way, throwing him momentarily off balance, just enough for the scythe's blade to miss his throat, but catch him across the chest, slicing through shirt and flesh in a diagonal slash. Haynes roared in pain and rage, blood blossoming across his chest as he lunged forward with his knife. Solomon pivoted, the months of fieldwork having honed his reflexes and balance. The knife sliced air where he had been a moment before, and Solomon brought the scythe around in a second swing. This time, the blade connected solidly with the overseer's shoulder, biting deep into muscle and bone. The impact sent vibrations up Solomon's arms, the sensation unlike anything he had experienced before, not the clean resistance of vegetation, but the complex layers of a human body yielding to steel. Haynes stumbled, his knife dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers as his right arm hung useless at his side. "You're dead," Haynes gasped, his face pale with shock and blood loss. You hear me, Reed? Dead. They'll hunt you with dogs. Tear you apart piece by piece. Solomon adjusted his grip on the scythe, preparing for the killing blow. Maybe, he acknowledged, his voice deadly calm once more. But you won't be there to see it. With a final decisive swing, Solomon brought the blade across Haynes's throat. The cut was clean and deep, severing the major vessels in a single stroke. Blood fountained from the wound, spraying across Solomon's face and chest as Haynes clutched futilely at his throat, his eyes wide with the realization of his own mortality. The overseer took 2 staggering steps backward, his boot crashing through another rotted plank. As his balance failed him, Haynes toppled over the edge of the dock into the muddy waters of the Yazoo River. The splash was followed by a frantic thrashing that quickly weakened as life drained from the overseer's body. Within moments, the water stilled, stained crimson in the fading light. Solomon stood motionless on the dock, the bloody scythe still clutched in his hands, his breath coming in rapid gasps as the enormity of what he had done crashed over him. He had killed a white man, the ultimate transgression in the Southern social order, a crime for which the punishment would be brutal and prolonged if he were caught. But beneath the fear and shock, another emotion surfaced, a fierce, vindictive satisfaction. Silas Haynes, the man who had tormented him for years, who had ordered Rachel's fatal whipping, who had embodied the daily cruelties of the slave system, was dead by his hand. In that moment of retribution, Solomon had reclaimed something vital that slavery had tried to strip away: his agency, his manhood, his right to protect what he loved. The satisfaction was short-lived, quickly replaced by the urgent need to flee. Night was falling rapidly, and soon Haynes's absence would be noted. Solomon had perhaps an hour, maybe 2, before a search began. Moving with deliberate efficiency, he wiped the scythe blade clean on the grass, and then tossed the weapon into the river near where Haynes had disappeared. The body might not be discovered immediately, especially if it was carried downstream by the current, but Solomon couldn't count on that delay. He needed to be far from Elmwood by dawn. Solomon made his way back up the path toward the plantation, his mind racing through the next steps of his plan. He would need supplies, food, water, perhaps a weapon if he could secure one without drawing attention. And he would need to find Isaiah, to signal that the time for escape had come sooner than expected. As Solomon neared the edge of the cleared area, a rustle in the undergrowth stopped him cold. He dropped into a crouch, cursing himself for not having kept the scythe as a weapon. Had someone witnessed the killing? Was Jeremiah Haynes waiting to ambush him? "Solomon!" A whispered voice emerged from the darkness. "It's me." Isaiah stepped onto the path, his expression tense in the deepening twilight. He took in Solomon's blood-spattered appearance with a quick glance. "You did it," he stated flatly. "Killed Haynes." It wasn't a question, but Solomon nodded anyway. "Yes, at the landing. Bodies in the river." He studied Isaiah's face, searching for signs of fear or judgment. "You still want to run with me?" Isaiah's response was immediate. "More than ever. They'll hunt you harder than they would for just escaping. We need to go now. Tonight." "I need to get some things from my cabin first," Solomon said, already moving toward the slave quarters. "Food, extra clothing. Meet me at the big cypress near the north field in 20 minutes. "Wait," Isaiah caught his arm. "You can't go back looking like that. Blood everywhere, and they're already looking for you." Solomon froze. "Looking for me? Why?" "Jeremiah came to the quarters right after sunset asking for you. Said his father wanted both of you at the landing." Isaiah's expression was grim. "When I said I hadn't seen you, he got suspicious. Started asking others. No one's seen you since you went to work on the path. The news changed everything. If Jeremiah was already suspicious, he might soon raise a general alarm. Going back to the slave quarters was now too risky. Solomon would be spotted immediately, and the blood on his clothing would confirm his guilt. "I have supplies hidden," Isaiah continued, as if anticipating Solomon's thoughts. "Food, water, a knife. Enough to get us started. Been gathering them for weeks, waiting for a chance to run." Solomon hesitated only a moment before nodding. The plan was unraveling, forcing improvisation, but there was no going back now. "Where?" "Follow me," Isaiah said, slipping back into the undergrowth beside the path. "We need to go east first, away from the river. They'll expect you to follow the water." Solomon cast one last glance toward Elmwood Plantation, the distant lights of the main house and slave quarters glowing softly in the gathering darkness. Everything he had known for most of his life lay in that direction. Not home, never that, but the familiar confines of his bondage. Ahead lay the unknown, danger, possible death, but also the tantalizing possibility of freedom. "Rachel," he whispered, a farewell and a promise combined. "It's done." Then he turned and followed Isaiah into the wilderness, leaving behind the blood-soaked ground where the overseer had drawn his last breath and a system of oppression had suffered one small but significant defeat. The journey north, and the true test of Solomon Reed's resolve, had begun. Chapter 4. The Pursuit. The owl's cry pierced the darkness, momentarily freezing Solomon and Isaiah in their tracks. They had been moving steadily eastward for hours, guided by the stars and Isaiah's surprising knowledge of the terrain beyond Elmwood's boundaries. Now, as the false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they paused at the edge of a small clearing to assess their progress and plan their next move. "Need to find water soon," Isaiah murmured, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the forest. "Canteen's nearly empty." Solomon nodded, his throat parched from exertion and the lingering terror of flight. The initial surge of vindictive satisfaction he had felt watching Haynes die had long since faded, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. They were now fugitives in a hostile land where every white face represented potential capture and every black face a possible informant, tempted by the reward that would surely be offered. "How far to the next plantation?" Solomon asked, scanning the gradually brightening landscape for landmarks. "Butler's place should be about 3 miles east," Isaiah replied. "Smaller than Elmwood, maybe 50 slaves. No reputation for particular cruelty, but that doesn't mean much." The unspoken question hung between them. Should they risk approaching Butler's slaves for help? The Underground Railroad, that loose network of sympathizers who assisted fugitives northward, was known to have connections in Mississippi, but identifying those connections without exposing themselves to betrayal was a dangerous proposition. "We keep moving," Solomon decided after a moment's consideration. "Find water, rest during the hottest part of the day, then continue north when night falls again." Isaiah nodded his agreement, adjusting the small pack that contained their meager supplies. He had indeed been preparing for escape longer than Solomon had realized, having gradually accumulated essentials without drawing attention: a canteen, a crude but serviceable knife, strips of dried meat, a flint for starting fires, even a small pouch of salt. It wasn't much, but it represented the difference between desperate flight and planned escape. As they prepared to continue their journey, a new sound froze them in place, distant but unmistakable: hounds. The baying carried clearly through the still morning air, coming from the direction of Elmwood. "They've found Haynes," Solomon said grimly, "and they've got dogs on our trail already." Isaiah's face tightened with fear. "That's too soon. They shouldn't have organized a search party with dogs this quickly, not in the dark." Solomon's mind raced, calculating possibilities. Jeremiah must have gone looking for his father when he didn't return from the landing, found the blood, maybe the body if it washed up nearby. He closed his eyes briefly, cursing his own oversight. "And I left a clear trail from the landing back toward the plantation before you found me. They know exactly where to start tracking." The implications were severe. They had perhaps a few hours head start at most, far less than the day or more Solomon had hoped for. The dogs would follow their scent relentlessly, and mounted pursuers would cover ground much faster than 2 men on foot. "We need to split up," Isaiah suggested, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "Double their problem." Solomon shook his head firmly. "No, that just guarantees one of us gets caught. Together, we have a better chance." He thought rapidly, drawing on half-remembered stories and survival knowledge gleaned over years of attentive listening. "We need water, not just to drink, but to break the scent trail." They set off again, moving more quickly now, despite the risk of leaving more obvious signs of passage. Speed had become more important than stealth, at least until they could find a way to confuse the hounds. The sun had fully risen, burning away the morning mist, when they finally located what they sought: a narrow stream cutting through the forest, its water clear and cold from higher elevations. Without hesitation, they waded in, the shock of the chill temporarily overshadowed by the urgent need to throw off their pursuers. "Downstream," Solomon directed. "The current will help carry our scent away." They waded carefully, mindful of slippery rocks and the occasional deeper pool. The water reached mid-thigh at its deepest points, soaking their clothing but providing temporary respite from both the growing heat of the day and the relentless threat at their backs. After nearly a mile of following the stream, Solomon spotted a fallen tree whose massive trunk created a natural bridge across the water. "There," he pointed. "We'll use that to exit without leaving tracks on the bank." The maneuver was awkward, but effective. They climbed carefully onto the log, making their way across the stream before dropping down on the far side, where a rocky outcropping provided solid footing without revealing their direction of travel. "Now north," Solomon decided, orienting himself by the sun's position. "But we'll move through the rockiest ground we can find. Make it harder for the dogs." Isaiah nodded, his expression grim but determined. "There's a ridge about 2 miles north of here.